That shows up as essentially a negative value for everyone in our telemetry, but that's just telling you how quickly Dragon is closing in, and that's a relative velocity. Is both Dragon and Station traveling relative to the Earth, more than 17,000, but the relative velocity between the two will be fairly slow. Once we hit that final approach and docking, we'll be moving typically around or just a little bit below 1/10 of a meter per second. So it's going to be pretty slow and methodical crawl once we're up on the docking axis towards that docking itself, which should be coming in about 46 minutes from now. But next major milestone is going to be hitting waypoint 0, 400 meters below the station, and we are just at 9 minutes away from that expected time.
Houston Station on 2 for Dragon docking monitor.
Go ahead on 2.
Hey, Nicole, we're showing no video right now. Can you just confirm that's expected?
And yep, we can confirm that is expected. We are waiting until we switch the data rate, and then we'll be able to get that video.
Okay, station copies, thanks.
And again, a quick exchange between Woody Hoberg, who's prime for monitoring Dragon's approach from on board the space station, and the Capcom down here in Houston, Nicole Lewis. He was referring to no video. He's talking about getting video feed from Dragon itself as it approaches. And the team here in Mission Control Houston confirming that that's expected, and we'll get that once we essentially switch to a higher data rate in our connection between station and Dragon. Once Dragon gets this close, we're essentially communicating with it on something called C2V2. That's common communications for visiting vehicles. That's a common control scheme that we use across a fleet of different spacecraft that now fly to the space station and dock to the US OS side. So all of the docking ports on either Node 2 or the berthing ports on Node 2 and Node 1. And that allows us to essentially transfer data back and forth between the two spacecraft, and also use the space station's downlink system through the TDRS satellites to also get video not only to the crew on board station, but that serves as an additional command path to get Dragon data down here to the teams. Once Dragon is docked to the space station, it'll essentially switch off all of its transmitting antennas and move to using station systems. That'll happen once we get docked and get umbilicals deployed. Those will start to provide power and data to Dragon using those station systems. So Dragon has its own solar arrays, its own batteries on board that it's able to charge and power all of its systems throughout free flight. But while it's docked and goes into what's known as a quiescent mode, we're able to essentially power down those different systems and just plug Dragon into the station's much larger ones. So it'll essentially become an integrated piece of the space station while it's docked, able to draw from those large solar arrays to power its systems on board, a lot of which get powered down once we are docked, but also, again, be able to use the station's different data downlink systems to continue to feed telemetry from Dragon down to the ground. We also integrate the cabin atmosphere of Dragon with the rest of the station stack itself, so it essentially becomes almost like another module for the time while it's docked. They'll install ducting just to make sure we have just an active feed of that atmosphere as any time you're operating in a microgravity environment, you don't have that natural convection, so we have basically active air handlers just pushing air through the station to make sure you have that circulation. That's so you're able to constantly scrub carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, make sure you're distributing oxygen, things of that nature. So the crew will, once they get the hatches open, initiate a lot of that work, and then it's going to be pretty much immediately cargo unload duties for the crew. And so as of this moment, we're about 450 meters dragging away from the space station, expecting to be at waypoint 0 in less than 4 minutes. After we pass through waypoint 0, Dragon will start to swing up, out, and out in front of the space station until it hits a point just about 220 meters. And we'll again stay outside of that keep out sphere. We're already inside the approach ellipsoid. And then the team will do a go to proceed past waypoint 1 onto waypoint 2 before we even get to waypoint 1. As again, the expectation is we'll be able to move through each of these waypoints without holding, as long as everything continues to look good on Dragon and on the station side. And we're just continuing to hear some updates that everything's still looking good with Dragon. Again, it's primarily navigating right now using those Dragon Eye systems, which rely on a couple of different sensors. One of them LiDAR, a laser range finding, essentially bouncing a laser off different reflectors on board the station to give immediate real-time data to the flight computer of just distance away from station, and also that range rate. Again, we're constantly looking at just how far and how quickly it's approaching, to make sure we're following the expected flight path. We're going to hit waypoint 0 in a little less than 2.5 minutes, and then start to swing up to waypoint 1. Everything continuing to run about 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Originally, we were looking at a docking at about 6:52 a.m. Central Time, but we're now looking at that just 40 minutes or so from now, at about 6:28 a.m. Central. So we could hit there sooner, but everything continuing to run pretty smoothly so far with the approach and docking. We are coming up less than 2 minutes away from waypoint 0, and then Dragon will be ready to move on to waypoint 1. We'll see it swing up in front of the space station. And we are less than a minute away from waypoint 0.
2 for MHU.
And go ahead on 2.
Hey, Tommy, looking for your go on step 10.1 for MH unit removal. Step, 10.1.
Yes, Frank, you are go at step 10.1 and still can meet you on space ground 3.
Great, thanks so much.
And it should be just about 10 seconds away until we pass waypoint 0. It was NASA astronaut Frank Rubio, who's off working on a couple of different science items. He will join Woody Hoberg and Steve Bowen, as well as Sultan Al Niadi, with some cargo transfer operations with Dragon a little bit later in the day. And confirmation, we have moved past waypoint 0. Next up is going to be waypoint 1, so we're going to see Dragon now start to not only get closer, but start to swing up and out in front of the space station itself. The crew's going to continue to monitor throughout this process. They're just still making sure that Dragon essentially keeps a range outside of that keep out sphere. Really, they don't want to see it approaching closer than a little less than 200 meters away, but it's going to stop at a point directly in front of the station at about 220 meters, so we're still maintaining that distance outside of the keep out sphere. So you've got teams here in Houston watching the systems on board Dragon. You've got the primary Dragon team out at MCCX and Hawthorne controlling the systems, but again, Dragon largely flying itself. And then we have Woody Hoburg as prime on board the station, monitoring Dragon during its final approach. But we're already a little less than 400 meters away, and Dragon's already starting to move up to waypoint 1. In about 12 minutes or so, we'll get the go-no-goes between the joint NASA.
2, we see range inside 400 meters. Vehicle mode is transition to docking axis, and attitude is as expected.
Copy all. That's great news. Thanks.
Woody Hoburg just reporting again. Dragon spacecraft a little less than 400 meters away now from the space station, moving up to the docking axis, so that's going to line it up, not perfectly, but essentially right in front of its expected docking port. And since we're going to the forward port, that's going to be directly in front of the space station itself. And then attitude, just talking about which way Dragon's pointing. And again, we're going to be essentially expecting it to point nose forward directly at station for the remainder of this flight, as that's where your primary navigation cluster is located. And so that's going to continue to point at Dragon or at station even as it begins to swing up and out in front. And then obviously pointed that direction once we get into the final docking is the docking ring, and all of the capture mechanisms are at that very top part of Dragon. And this is Mission Control Houston. Everything continuing to go smoothly with Dragon's approach to the International Space Station. We're a little less than 20 minutes, about 19 and a half minutes away from the expected arrival at waypoint number 1. And that'll put us just about 220 meters directly in front of the station on what's known as the docking axis. So again, if you were to essentially draw an imaginary line straight through the middle of the space station with the docking port on the forward end of node 1, that's where we are headed. And so it'll get to waypoint 1 in a little less than 10 minutes. The teams are going to do a joint go, no-go to essentially proceed beyond waypoint 1 and on to waypoint 2, which is our final waypoint before we actually get into docking, and that will be inside of that keep out sphere and is a position about 20 meters in front. So expectation is everything continues to look good on Dragon and on station as we'll move right past waypoint 1 and on to waypoint 2. And then even once we get to waypoint 2, we might only have a short pause before we proceed in for that final approach and docking. Again, Dragon's going to continue to fly itself autonomously. You've got a couple of different teams and individuals in the loop monitoring and able to send commands to the vehicle on board the station. We've got NASA astronaut Woody Hoberg, who's been radioing down some different performance calls to the teams, but again, everything we've heard so far is everything looking as expected. Dragon right now a little over 330 meters away from the station. We're expecting it to close in to about 220. Some of the primary stuff that Woody and the different teams on the ground are looking for is just Dragon maintaining the appropriate distance away from station, and as it continues this very gradual swing up to the docking axis. During that final approach, we'll see it start to close in on the forward port of Node 2, the Harmony module, where we have one of our 2 international docking adapters. This will be taking the port that was just vacated by the Crew 5 mission on board Dragon Endurance when they came back just last weekend. And this Dragon for the 27th resupply mission for SpaceX expected to stay docked for about 30 days, during which the crew members on board of Expedition 68 will be unloading the approximately 6,000 pounds of cargo that's flying up for them. There's also a payload in Dragon's trunk that's going to be removed and attached to station robotically that has a suite of different research projects on board. Some of the experiments will come off, and then they'll immediately have to essentially install, execute, and then load back onto Dragon before it comes home later on in April. Dragon, in addition to being in the fleet of cargo vehicles delivering cargo, is really the primary means we have, the only means that we have to deliver large amounts of cargo back down to Earth. And so we're able to essentially bring a lot of those different research experiments back home for then further analysis on the ground. We don't do a lot of the actual analysis, or very little of the analysis to get results from the hundreds of experiments taking place on station. It doesn't happen on station. We need to get it back down to the different scientist labs back down here on planet Earth and Dragon, that critical pipeline right now to get that research back down. Also have the ability to return different hardware to the ground. So we've brought things like spacesuits back in the past for analysis and refurbishment before eventually flying them back up on Dragon. There is one, it's called an SEMU. It stands for short EMU. It's essentially the acronym that we use for the primary part of a spacewalking spacesuit, that extravehicular mobility unit. One of those is packed away on Dragon that's going to be delivered for use on future spacewalks, which should be picking up a little bit later in the summer as we continue to essentially outfit the station and prepare to go through the final stages of installing new solar arrays, with that final pair expected to fly a little bit later this year, potentially as early as this summer. But just checking in on the ops right now, we're about 5 minutes away from our teams here in Houston and out at Hawthorne doing their joint go-no-goes to proceed beyond waypoint 1, at which point we'll be able to move into waypoint 2. We're a little less than 15 minutes away. So Dragon right now is moving from a position beneath the station to right out in front of it. And we're going to see it essentially staring the station down, and pretty soon we're also going to be switching to a higher data rate of communications between Dragon and the station, using that common communication for visiting vehicles, that C2V2 system, and that's what's going to start to deliver live views from the Dragon camera, both to the crew on board, and then should be delivering that down to us here on the ground, and we'll be able to show you the view from Dragon as it starts to approach. Right now, we are in a quick handover. So essentially, the satellites that the station uses to communicate with all the teams down here on the ground, the TDRS, the tracking data, and relay satellites. That's how we get all of our telemetry, our data, everything down here on the ground. We'll be getting that shortly. Right now, though, you're looking at Marcos Flores. He's the flight director leading the Orbit 1 team in the room here in Houston. And he's leading those joint go-no-goes between us and SpaceX as we get through the final approaches of Dragon. And just above him at the Capcom position is Nicole Lewis, so she's the voice you're going to be hearing talking back and forth with Woody Hoberg and the other crew members on board the space station right now. But it looks like we're already getting back those views. So the space station right now in that orbital daytime. So now this is a camera view from the top part of station, essentially looking out into the front, and you can see Dragon start to slowly make its way up. It's going to eventually be pretty much right in front of the space station, looking dead on the docking axis towards that front port of Node 2. So it's doing this pretty slowly. It's not really increasing its proximity to the space station. It's not really getting any closer at this point. We'll get about 100 meters closer or so over the next 12 minutes, but primarily just doing that translational maneuver to move up and out in front to the docking axis. And we expect it to be there in about 12 and a half minutes. And then we'll swing right through waypoint 1 and onto waypoint 2, which will bring us just 20 meters away from the station and get us ready for that final docking. And everything continuing to run about 20 minutes ahead of schedule. We are expecting docking about 25 minutes from now, so it should be happening at about 6:28 a.m. Central Time. We'll get an exact docking time, though, once Dragon makes that initial contact with the forward port on Node 2.